Thank you. Thank you very much. This talk is based on joint work with a colleague at RAND, sociologist Robert Bozic, and a colleague who's now at Peking University, Iran Liu, who was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, also in sociology. And this research is supported by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development through a PO1 project that's tied to the collection of the next couple of rounds of the Transition into Adulthood supplement to PSID, which I'll tell you a little bit about as we go along over here. By way of introduction, the transition to adulthood, as many of you know, is sort of launched typically by teenagers or late adolescents completing high school, completing secondary school, and figuring out what they're going to do next in their life. So in this work, we're focused on the effects of childhood health on the overall process of transition to adulthood, with a particular initial focus on this high school completion process, which really marks the beginning phase of transitioning to adulthood. And our overall goal is to try to estimate the causal effects of childhood health conditions by child age on this initial marker of educational attainment. I'm also always happy to come and talk about the panel study of income dynamics, which I've worked on for the last almost 10 years, and to tell you at least a little bit about what's going on with PSID, and in particular with the child development supplement and the transition into adulthood supplements that I work on in particular, as well as core PSID. And this is very much a work in progress, so comments and suggestions and feedback are certainly welcome. So I'm going to start with some background and introduction and a brief overview of previous research, tell you about the data, and then provide an overview with kind of three different approaches to thinking about this relationship. One is to look at sort of specific childhood health conditions that we have information about, sort of diagnosed conditions. Another is sort of often a common way of looking at effects of capturing child health, which is sort of an overall assessment, in this case provided by the child's primary caregiver, which is typically the kid's mother. And then, because both of these have sort of strengths and limitations, a third approach that's perhaps the most appropriate is to try to figure out different classes of child health and different categories, and using a latent model to establish those. And then I'll end with some summary and next steps. So when thinking about the significance of child health, as sort of a broad matter, kids are generally pretty healthy, but there are some kids who aren't, and 1 or 2% of kids are really unhealthy in the sense of qualifying for actual disability that's sort of associated with serious health or developmental problems. However, there's a larger slice of kids in the U.S., maybe 7 to 10%, based on information from the National Health Interview Survey, that have chronic health conditions that actually affect their day-to-day lives. So we're interested in those, as well as kids who are further along the spectrum of having some health conditions, but not as severe as these perhaps. And although child health in the U.S. has generally improved steadily over time, these trends aren't uniformly positive. So as many of you might know, prevalence of quite a number of chronic conditions have actually been increasing over time. So increases in obesity trends are generally pretty well known, but there are also increases in other health conditions such as asthma, allergies, type 1 diabetes, and autism. And in addition, there are, of course, major race and ethnic disparities in these child health conditions. So child health obviously links with health more broadly over the entire life course, and it's sort of another reason to be concerned with and interested in child health and its effects. So child health may play a particularly important role in subsequent health outcomes over the life course, and it's obviously tied to policy in the direct sense of the U.S. often underinvesting in child health and dealing with specific health conditions. The effects of child health on later health outcomes can potentially occur in a couple of different ways. So one is sort of a direct connection. If you have poor health in childhood, it can be directly associated with health outcomes later in the life course. But another avenue that we're sort of interested in over here is how poor health in childhood may affect education levels which in turn may affect health outcomes and health disparities later in the life course. So through this mechanism, child health could be sort of a child health and its effects on educational attainment could be a mediator of the intergenerational transmission in socioeconomic status, to the extent that we see these large disparities in child health by SES. They're sort of replicated by low SES attainment and young adulthood, and then associated with poor health and lower socioeconomic status outcomes later in the life course. So this topic, obviously we're not the first to look at this topic. There is a sizable literature in several different disciplines that have analyzed sort of human capital acquisition more generally and transition to adulthood as well. Interestingly, a substantial focus of this work has been on the effects of prenatal and neonatal health, with especially large focus on the role of birth weight in affecting subsequent developmental outcomes. If you're interested in this topic, there's several recent literature reviews, one by Almond et al. That just came out, I guess, late last year. And actually a fair amount of research that has been done using PSID, including work by Dalton and colleagues of mine, Bob Shaney and Rocker Johnson and others. In addition, there's been a stream of research that has looked at specific health conditions in childhood. So I mentioned low birth weight, and there are sort of specific plausible pathways through which low birth weight can lead to neurological problems, lower achievement scores, and can affect educational attainment. Some of these other specific conditions include asthma, which is related with flare-ups and absenteeism, difficulty to participate in a wide range of school activities. And in our sort of look at health, we're certainly including behavioral and psychological problems, which can lead to attention deficit, not paying attention in class, and dropping out. However, in this stream of literature, there's been relatively few studies that have looked at child health during childhood, over the years of kind of middle childhood and adolescence, and looked at combinations of conditions. So that's really what our focus is on and where our contribution is, and also looking at when these conditions emerge at different stages during childhood and if those are significant. So the few studies that have looked at these health status during childhood have generally focused on reported health status. So oftentimes the young adult or the adolescent's own self-report of how they rated their own health on the standard scale, excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. And they find some effects that better health sort of increases the likelihood of finishing high school and having a greater number of years of completed schooling. There's also an interesting stream of literature that comes out of the historical literature and development literature that suggests that poor child health may not always be bad for schooling outcomes. And the story kind of goes this way: of like, if you're healthy, you may be sent out to the fields to work, and if you're not as healthy, then you invest in your comparative advantage, which is staying in school and working hard at your studies, because your payoff is bigger over there than it is either in the fields or playing sports or some other activity. So that argument, works pretty well when thinking about physical health status. Maybe doesn't work so well considering developmental problems or behavioral issues. But there is evidence supporting the fact that there is such a mechanism that operates. And then I think a final point here is that it's not just kids' health, but it's also how families respond to kids' health that is likely to be really important in the consequences of having poor health outcomes for education and later transitions, including not just changes in behavior by parents, such as maybe quitting their job, staying home to look after a sick kid, but also spillover effects across siblings. So are your siblings sick as well, or do you have a sick sibling, and does that have some consequences for you? So a few words on the methodological challenges for looking at this. So it's challenging because there are a bunch of factors that affect both child health as well as educational outcomes. So it's important to control for those. and potential interactions with parents' education and race, as well as time-varying, both time-invariant and time-varying effects such as income. So I've mentioned that some of these change potentially in response to kids' healthcare outcomes, both their own as well as their siblings. And our approach for dealing with these is to estimate marginal structural models as the first sort of step in addressing these issues of controlling for background family characteristics while looking at the emergence of child health conditions at specific ages. And then what I think is, what seems to me is sort of a major caveat in thinking about this and in studying this, not just with PSID, but also with many other data sources, is that reporting and data quality errors really may affect our results and how we interpret the results. And sort of I'll say just a brief word here, and it'll come up again in the talk. The major concern really is differential knowledge that parents have about health conditions when they emerge, and their patterns of reporting about those health conditions over time for their kids. So the three specific questions that we set out to address here are: first, do health conditions across childhood limit educational attainment, initially in young adulthood? Does the effect of childhood health conditions depend on the age at which they emerge? And there are a couple of hypotheses here about what might happen. So earlier emergence might just lead to more disadvantage because you're exposed to these bad health conditions for a longer period of time. On the other hand, kids and families and schools can adapt to those poor health conditions. And so it actually could be the case that having an earlier onset could allow you to adapt, whereas having a later onset, particularly in adolescence, may not give you time to sort of figure out how to deal with new health problems and maybe more deleterious. And then finally, do childhood health conditions play any role in sort of in establishing or explaining the intergenerational transmission of socioeconomic status? So let me switch now to telling you a little bit about PSID. So the data that we have, that we're using over here, come from the PSID Child Development Supplement. So there are 3 waves of data collected in 97, 2002, and 2007. The educational outcome measures come from the Transition to Adulthood Supplement, which picks up these same kids from CDS when they cross the threshold into young adulthood, so when they're 18 years of age or older. And there have been 5 waves completed to date. And another wave, we're actually in the field right now in the 2017 Transition to Adulthood Supplement. But these 2 studies being connected to PSID means that we have information from core PSID about family circumstances throughout these kids' childhood years, and data on approximately 2,800 children in our sample. So being able to draw from these different data sources allows us to control for a whole bunch of factors, especially at the household and family level related to earnings, employment, education, health, family composition, marriage, and other factors. So the CDS, if you're not familiar with, was a representative sample of kids in PSID families. It began in 1997 with a cohort of kids who were 0 to 12 years old at the time. There were about 3,600 of them, and they were followed prospectively over time. There were up to 2 kids selected in each family. And the goal really was to understand the social, psychological, and economic aspects of kids and their family environments, and with also measures of their schools and their neighborhoods. 3 waves were collected where these kids have now all transitioned into adulthood. All of them are 18 years of age or older. And in 2014, we launched the successor to CDS, which now collects data on all kids in PSID families with the goal of repeating this every 5 or 6 years. So we're actually far along in our plans. We just got word that we were funded to collect the next round of CDS in 2019. So our goal is to sort of continue this every 5 to 6 years and follow these kids, not just through childhood, but as I'll explain, over the rest of their life course. So the transition to adulthood supplement was really to figure out what was happening in these young adult years and to measure outcomes in shorter intervals in these sort of more dense years when kids are making decisions and behavioral outcomes are changing relatively rapidly, in terms of decisions about schooling, about marriage, about living arrangements, and so forth. So we've collected 6 waves starting in 2005. We're currently in the field. We cover kids who are between about 18 and 27 years of age in the transition to adulthood supplement. So when you put these things together with this key feature of PSID, which is that all these kids who are born into PSID families get the PSID gene, and when they form their own independent households, they get to join the study as independent respondents themselves. And so across CDS, the transition to adulthood supplement, and core PSID, we're really set up to follow these kids over their entire life courses. So we're focused on this initial part about health during childhood and the initial transition into adulthood, but really have the potential to look at this over a much longer life course. Okay, so this is what we're focusing on here, this outcome, which is whether these young adults completed high school by age 18. So these are these outcomes in PSID for the CDS cohort. So about 10%, almost 11% of kids did not graduate from high school. About 84% received a regular high school diploma, so completed 12 years of completed to 12th grade, and another 5 or 6% completed high school by getting a graduate equivalent diploma, so taking the GED exam. And so in most of this work, we're actually grouping the GED and diploma kids together and just looking at whether the young adult in this case graduated from high school or not. So this is what that trend looks like over time. So it sort of increased slowly for the last 30 years or so, and more recently, so the red line marks the first year that kids in the CDS cohort reached 18 years of age, and in the period since then, high school graduation rates have actually been increasing from about the mid to high 80% range to the low 90% range. So our methods, as I mentioned, is to use marginal structural models and to construct inverse probability of treatment weights to account for background characteristics to get a better handle on the causal effects of childhood health. And the goal really is to just reweight and to achieve some balance by these background characteristics. We're estimating the likelihood of treatment based on observed characteristics both from CDS and from core PSID. And we construct a propensity score and then a weight and use these to weight the models that look at the effects of childhood health on high school graduation. So we have 3 sets of outcomes that we're focused on over here. So a first set are a detailed set of measures that were collected in each wave of the Child Development Supplement that include that focus mostly on parents, or in particular a primary caregiver who's the adult who's interviewed in conjunction with the kid, and reports about specific diagnoses of conditions that a health provider has provided about the kid. And so we group these health conditions into several different outcomes, including acute conditions, which are ones such as recurrent ear infections, allergies, headaches, reports of anemia, asthma, a set of conditions that we group together that are chronic conditions, including diabetes, epilepsy, a heart condition, orthopedic impairment, ADHD, which is attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, developmental delay, which includes autism, sensory limitations, and speech impairments. And then because we also measured height and weight for the kids in the sample, we're able to construct a measure of body mass index, which gives us an indicator of obesity. So we have one set of measures based on all these individual characteristics. And then we have a measure that people have often used as sort of a handy summary measure of all these different conditions. In this case, it's the PCG's assessment of the child's health. So does she rate the kid as being in excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor health? And we use we divided into two categories, distinguishing kids who are reported to be in excellent health versus the other four categories. And then our third approach is to look across all of these different conditions and see if we can come up with a smaller set of coincident conditions that sort of characterize kids to be in a small number of groups. And I'll go through each of these as I show you the results. So the covariates in this first stage where we're constructing the weights include a large variety of household variables, some mother characteristics, and some background kid characteristics, including birth outcome related variables and some earlier measures of cognitive achievement. We look in particular at two stages of childhood. We don't look at early childhood for a variety of reasons, and I can come back to that later. But we're really focused on the middle childhood years, so when kids start school, so ages 5 to 10 years, and then later childhood, which begins at 11 years and ends at 16 years, which is sort of about the point when kids can sort of make a decision to drop out of school on their own. So we didn't go up to 18 years of age. We sort of leave the last 2 years of adolescence out of the child health measure, since that's really when the outcome is occurring. And our results suggest a reasonable model fit for this first stage model, with definitely a case of having stronger predictors in later childhood compared to earlier childhood. In some ways, it's a challenge to understand sort of why this occurs, but in some ways, maybe not so surprising. That there's sort of new knowledge. The longer you're raising a kid, the more information you have about their health conditions and what they mean and how they affect your kid. Okay, so let me turn now to a first set of results, which are focused on these individual health conditions that I mentioned. So this is a list of all the health conditions, and just to begin with, providing you with sort of an overview of the prevalence of these different health conditions among kids in the Child Development Supplement. So here are the most prevalent conditions. So asthma is among the most prevalent chronic conditions that kids experience, and 14 or 15%, depending on the stage of childhood, of kids in CDS have asthma. As all of you know, obesity is a major concern among kids in the U.S. So 1 in 3 kids is overweight, and a little over 1 in 10 is actually obese in CDS. There are a fair number of kids with developmental problems. And so this is one of the interesting things, is how the prevalence of these conditions increases a bit as these kids go from middle childhood to late childhood. So it could be the case that some of these conditions emerge, though for various reasons I'm a little bit more skeptical about that than the possibility of these things are maybe identified more clearly in later childhood than they might be in middle childhood. So the first set of regression results that I'm going to present over here, it's a big complex table, and I'll throw up all the figures in a second, but also try to point out some of the patterns over here. But what I'm showing you here are a set of 3 different models. So the first model that's going to be in the first column here is just a plain simple bivariate regression to show you the relationship between each of these conditions on its own, separately from middle childhood and late childhood, on the likelihood of graduating from high school. The second regression includes this sort of full inverse probability of treatment weighting, so it controls for all these background characteristics and gives us a much cleaner estimate of what the effects of childhood health, of these specific childhood health conditions are on high school graduation. But it looks at the effects of these conditions separately by the different stage of childhood. And then the third column, the column on the right over there, looks at each condition jointly at these 2 different stages of childhood. So this begins to get at this issue about, does it matter when a condition emerges in terms of its effect on kids' high school graduation likelihood. So a bunch of numbers here. but several things to focus on. So the results across these two models, so both before and after controlling for these background characteristics and providing a sort of cleaner assessment, are relatively consistent. That said, there are a variety of measures that are significant just in the simple bivariate relationships that are not significant once we control for background characteristics, but a fair number of conditions that do remain significantly associated with high school graduation. So starting at the bottom over here are measures of behavioral problems. So we have two separate measures that we look at, externalizing behavioral problems. So this is sort of acting out or aggressive behavior, and internalizing behavioral problems, which are withdrawn or depressive symptoms and related behaviors. And both of those are strongly associated with having a lower likelihood of completing high school. At the top over here, we see some negative effects of having ADHD or speech impairments. So the results both change and remain, some change, some remain the same when we move to this last model where we look at the effects of both at these two different periods, middle childhood and late childhood, with really the strongest effects remaining for these behavioral problems. Both externalizing, which is significant at the 10% level, but especially these internalizing behaviors being associated with a lower likelihood of graduating from high school. And no very clear or consistent pattern across the other specific health conditions that are listed over here. So there's a little bit of a takeaway here, but obviously it's complicated by the fact that many of these health conditions are coincident, and so it's hard to sort of get a clear story, except the one part that emerges about these behavioral problems. There's a little bit of a sort of signal that ADHD and developmental delay may have negative effects, but in both cases, only in this later period. So conditional on kind of health in middle childhood, and sort of the emergence of these behavioral problems in later childhood that really seem to be more important for whether kids are successfully completing high school. So I'm going to switch now to talking about the kid's overall health rating as provided by the child's primary caregiver. So this is what it looks like. So kids are generally healthy, and the reports, the mother's reports on their health lines up with that. So only 1 in 5 kids is reported as having health less than excellent. There are slightly more kids not reported in excellent health in late childhood compared to middle childhood. So what does it capture? What do these measures capture? And so our notion is that parents, because they're reporting about these specific health conditions, that they sort of somehow use that information and information about other kids who are either in their family or that they interact with on a day-to-day basis to assess their own kids' health status. So both what the conditions are that they're told about by a physician diagnosis. So it depends on going to a doctor and having a doctor tell you your kid has that condition, and then sort of assessing what the implications are. And so what we see in middle childhood is what I describe as some significant effects of internalizing problems that we saw before. Anemia and asthma also emerging as sort of strong predictors of a likelihood of not reporting your kid in excellent health, but relatively little else. Those same specific health conditions are also related to reports of kids' health in late childhood, but interestingly, a whole bunch of other conditions also emerge as sort of significant predictors of health in late childhood that don't emerge as predictors in middle childhood. So it could be that some of these conditions are emerging. It could be some of these conditions are that the mother is sort of newly aware of some of these conditions. And there's some important ones here. None of the obesity or anthropometric measures are related to middle childhood health assessments, but they are related to health assessments in later childhood, as well as these sort of potentially important ones of acute conditions and chronic conditions that kids may experience. So there are three different models that we estimate to look at the effects of these of the PCG's assessment of the kids' health on likelihood of high school graduation. A first model just looks at health in middle childhood. A second model just looks at the effects of health in late childhood. And the third one puts the two together and estimates both effects in the same model. So middle childhood turns out to have no effect when looked at on its own. Maybe a suggestion that better health in late childhood is associated with higher high school graduation, and then everything kind of goes out the window when we control for them both. So a somewhat puzzling finding that having poor health in middle childhood actually increases your likelihood of graduating, conditional on your health in later childhood. And I don't have a good story here, though I have a couple of ideas about what's going on and things to look at in more detail to try to explain some of this. So one part of this is that it's what these results together, especially in this last model, is saying, is that trajectories are important. So if you start off in, if a kid is in a downward trajectory, so they start off in good health and they end up in poor health, they're kind of at the bottom. They have kind of the most negative effect of their health conditions on their likelihood of graduating. And sort of these upward trajectories are definitely a good thing to have. But surprisingly, neither of those other outcomes of remaining in good health or remaining in poor health they're sort of in the middle. And I'm not sure that I have a clear story of it, other than how these conditions are reported and how they change as the kid ages may really be part of what's behind the story of explaining why the effects of health in middle childhood might end up being backwards over here. And then the third part, which we have looked at and does seem to be part of the story, though we don't have it nailed down completely, so I'm not going to show you a specific table here today, kind of goes along with that story about reporting. And so by looking at reporting based on parents' characteristics, it seems that this sort of unexpected relationship really tends to be more clearly apparent among parents with less education, and that we see a much more consistent and clear story among parents with higher education levels, which sort of goes along with this idea that sort of parents of higher SES have a much better handle on their kids' health conditions earlier in life, in part because they're able to take them to the healthcare providers and to be able to process that information and report it. Okay, so definitely the middle part is somewhat troubling, a lot having to do with sort of how parents absorb this information and able to report it. But this idea of going from sort of all these detailed health conditions to something more easily classifiable and distinguishable for different health conditions is sort of our goal in this third approach. And so what we're trying to do here is to start with a latent class model in order to look at these sort of variety of health conditions, and separately for middle childhood and late childhood, and assess whether they sort of combine, whether they group together in a way that provides us with sort of clear, distinct, different categories of kids' health conditions at each particular childhood stage. And so what we find here, and I'm showing you the results for middle childhood, is that we end up with four really clear categories emerging from this latent class analysis. So the first category is poor health. So a little under 8% of kids in CDS have poor health across essentially all of these different outcomes. So they have poor behavioral problems, as well as high rates of developmental delay, of acute conditions, of chronic conditions, basically everything. At the other end of the spectrum, we have about 30% of kids who seem to be in good health on just about every single assessment of health status that we measured in CDS. And then in the middle are two interesting categories. The labels are obviously ones that we came up with ourselves. That first column on the left, with about a little under 20% of the sample, are what we'd characterize as high behavioral problems. And the column on the right, the moderate problems, is really kids who have sort of moderate levels of problems across both behavioral and physical health conditions. So what you see in this high behavioral problems group is that they have really the highest scores on the behavioral problems index for both externalizing and internalizing behaviors. And apart from those in poor health, but compared to the other three groups, really high rates of ADHD, diagnosis with ADHD. And then this group is sort of moderate levels throughout all the different health conditions. So again, we're going to estimate a series of three models, one controlling for middle childhood alone, one for late childhood alone, and then a third model with both sets of results. So the first model, we're contrasting good health, which is the omitted category, with three other categories, the three other latent classes, and find strong negative effects of being in poor health in either of those other categories compared to being in good health. Strong negative effects on the likelihood of graduating from high school. With actually the largest negative effect, though I don't know if those differences between them are significant, but there seems to be sort of a gradient with these moderate problems being the most deleterious. So when we look at late childhood alone, we get a clear estimate of these behavioral problems being the most significantly negative associations with high school graduation. And when we put these two together, that pattern remains. So these results, when we sort of collapse and rearrange the data in a way that we think sort of teases apart the different combinations of conditions, tells us a story that in many ways is quite similar with the first picture that we had of looking at these detailed conditions, which is that these behavioral problems that emerge, especially during middle childhood, during late childhood, so during adolescence, so from ages 11 to 16, are really problematic for kids and for their educational attainment. There are certainly some indications that some other of these problems, the moderate health conditions, may also have an effect, but a bit of a surprising result that these poor health conditions, although they're negative here and we don't end up with anything strange going on, they're not significant. It's a small group, admittedly, but the parameter estimates are not especially large and negative. So to summarize and tell you something about the next steps, so back to our kind of research questions that we started off with. Do childhood health conditions affect high school graduation? Yes, we find some clear effects over here, in particular relating to health conditions in late childhood or adolescence, and evidence that behavioral problems, especially internalizing and externalizing to a lesser degree, have strong negative effects on high school completion. They're only really observed the effects of them emerging in late adolescence is really important. And a twist on this measure, which I kind of alluded to as I've sort of described how we obtained and constructed these different measures, each of the other health conditions, apart from anthropometry, but all these conditions such as ADHD and asthma and so forth, are reported by the parents based on their interaction with the healthcare provider. In contrast, the Behavioral Problems Index has no healthcare connection, right? So these are parents who are reporting not about behavioral problems in general, but reporting on a series of about 30 or 35 specific behaviors that their child engages in. Like, do they get angry? Do they act out? Do they hit their siblings? Do they calm down soon afterwards? Do they have react badly if you discipline them? So it's sort of an objective assessment among all these measures that we have that's sort of certainly more normalized across the different families to the extent that parents can report sort of accurately on these conditions that they have. So in some ways it's surprising, in some ways it's not so surprising that these come out so clearly related to the outcome that we're looking at. So do effects of childhood health depend on the age of emergence? Maybe. So we seem to find stronger effects of problems in late childhood, though I would say here that these measurement problems may be a source of some of this. So the issue sort of goes something like this. So I haven't shown you much about the early childhood health problems, in part because it's sort of it's less of our interest because they're not kind of directly school related. But there's definitely the story of how parents become aware of health problems in their kids, and whether they go to a doctor and get diagnosed with these conditions often is a process that has to do with the schools and with their engagement with the healthcare system. And so you can certainly tell a plausible story of kids from disadvantaged families often don't learn about health problems until they go to school. So a kid who's hyperactive and running around, maybe it's just a hyperactive kid, and my kid has a lot of energy. When you send your kid to school, it turns out, well, actually they have ADHD, and it's something, a diagnosis of which emerges both through the classroom as well as teachers sending kids to see doctors about specific conditions. But there's also kind of a substantive argument or relationship here, which is that these health conditions that emerge during late childhood may be more difficult for children and families to react to, so that they're less able to figure out how to compensate for those health problems and how to adapt. And there may be especially tricky interactions with how families are able to adapt to try to deal with health problems among their kids. So does child health play a role in this intergenerational transmission of SES? Well, maybe. We haven't looked at that directly, but all the pieces sort of are pointing in the right direction. So there's strong gradients in children's health. There's a relationship between children's health and educational outcomes, and educational outcomes are related with SES and health over the life course. So some limitations and next steps. So I've highlighted some of these measurement challenges. They're related to lack of access to healthcare, which is hard for a survey to kind of overcome. And it's hard to assess many of these conditions sort of with objective measures. Even if we're out there in the homes and able to directly observe the kids or figure out ways to collect other types of measures that would allow us to do sort of an independent assessment on our own. But we do have some ideas about how to deal with these. One in particular is a new module that we're currently administering in the field right now as part of the Transition to Adulthood 2017 wave, which kind of takes advantage of one of the key features of that study and kind of one of the key limitations of CDS, which is in CDS we get these kind of snapshots at kind of, at best sort of 3 random times during kids' childhood. We're not really able to sort of take this long view of sort of, what happened throughout your entire childhood. What was your health like, overall 18 years or, some long period of childhood. So I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about what we're doing over there if I have some time. But we've designed a module to try to collect these retrospective reports and to ask more questions about how these young adults, their experience of poor childhood health during childhood affected the types of behaviors that we think are related to educational attainment and other outcomes in the transition to adulthood. We have a linkage project, one that's looking at getting birth records and linking them to PSID. That's a little bit less directly related to what I've been talking about today, except to provide kind of better controls for background characteristics. So I have a whole slide on this, on this measure, on these retrospective measures that we're constructing, but I'm going to kind of skip that and then tell you about a few other things that we're working on now, and I can come back and talk about more about the measures if people are interested in hearing more about those. But we have a bunch of additional work that we're planning on this project to extend the outcomes that we're looking at beyond just these initial health measures. Our next measure on the list is looking at whether kids attend college, which is obviously a next big step in this process, but also have sort of a rich array of measures of employment behavior, both during high school as well as in young adult years, in family formation behaviors, whether kids move out and when they move out on their own to live independently from their parents. So really a rich set of measures that can give us a much broader perspective about how childhood health trajectories affect the transition to adulthood. So let me stop there.